Well, the topic of this first session is religion and development. I think implicitly we were focusing yesterday on the diplomatic. And one of my thoughts as I was listening was how many more tools there are when you actually get into development, just in the sense of more people with more interactions, lots of resources, et cetera. And obviously you have a hugely complex set of development institutions now, but the multiplication, I sometimes call it the sorcerer's apprentice, that there's so many institutions involved in development, public, private, foundations, et cetera, that it's probably about as complicated as the religious landscape. But it's important that the religious dimension be part of it. This cartoon, which I've loved for a long time, I've had it in a couple of books, seems particularly apt at this point, but the point is the religious minefields. So the themes that I wanted to talk about, by the way, I'm standing here because I'm obviously trying to keep myself to the point, and just tell me when I get to what, 10 minutes? 15, tell me, and I'll stop. So I'll just do as much as I can. The questions that we've been asking, and I've been doing this now for roughly 15 years, is what do religious aspects have to do with development? In other words, the primary focus is development, not religion. And it's what's religion got to do with it? Why does it matter? In other words, it's interesting, but why does it matter if you're in a policy seat? What are the specific implications for policy, and what should be done about it? That's sort of very much the echoing some of the questions that came up yesterday. And the basic hypothesis is that religion matters for each and every issue, though in different ways. Just as an example, the United Nations Foundation asked us to look at energy access and religion, and my thought was there's not going to be anything. But in fact, there was a lot. Lots on solar energy, clean cook stoves, and even some groups that are starting to get involved in issues of pricing and the grid. As we said yesterday, no simple answers. Context is vital. One factor that we've come across is more than most other subjects, certainly more than, say, transport or microfinance, is that individual leaders play a huge role. And we've seen time and time again that there's a leader, whether it's Thoraya Obaid in UNFPA or the Norwegian Minister of Development or Jim Wolfenson at the World Bank or whoever, who gets it, as we would say, starts an initiative, and then their successor comes in and has a very different view and a very different set of priorities. In the World Bank, Quentin, you were a little bit closer to it at the time, but I don't think Bob Zoellick, who succeeded Wolfenson and Wolfowitz, I don't think he asked for a briefing on any topic related to religion in 5 years. And at least I had no evidence that he did. And now Jim Myung Kim, who is the current president, is very interested, met with the Pope, invited a Buddhist leader to meditate with the staff. So in any event, you have a hugely disproportionate influence of individual leaders. And an issue that came up yesterday has been very much a question. I call it the PPO, the priority pecking order. That people say, yeah, that's very interesting. I'm going to do that. We're going to organize courses. But in the lived reality of priorities, they don't do it. In other words, it's just not in the priority until there's a crisis, and then things come up. We're dealing with hugely complex issues. I was at a meeting in Berlin in December where one of the things that surprised me was people questioning the word development. They were also questioning a lot by whose authority. And this whole question around, I had not heard this fundamental questioning about development as a word. We all know that knowledge and evidence is critically important, but how is it defined and how is it presented? And that's where we are in the Berkley Center, and WFDD is focusing on trying to take development issues, say, what's religion got to do with it, and so forth. I have a few examples of a recent brief that we've done that I call a primer on Bangladesh, which is sort of what, and I'll circulate some of these copies just because we'd be very interested in having feedback, because we're trying to make these useful and to get attention, and it's been very difficult. But that's the mission. 4 quick stories. I was working on Senegal in the early 90s, and there was a massive crisis. In 1991, all of a sudden, the Murid went on the radio, the Murid Khalifa went on the radio and called the Taliban from all over the world, the followers, to come to Senegal. And within the space of a couple of weeks, 173 square miles of gazetted forest disappeared. And over 6,000 pastoralists were evicted. And the development community went ballistic, because there was conditionality and structural adjustment operations, that the government would protect the environment, et cetera. Actually, in 4 years of working on the Sahel department, this was the only time that I can recall that a major issue affecting religion came onto my desk as the director. And what was fascinating about this was that it completely blindsided the entire development community, and no one had any idea how to deal with it. Of course, the forest was gone at this point. It was peanuts. It's probably under peanuts now, but this is the Mbege forest. But it was a fascinating example of how these things become very practical. Second quick story, when Wolfensohn launched his dialogue with the Archbishop of Canterbury, people from the Vatican, various other religious leaders in 1998, he and the Aga Khan, et cetera, they had a series of meetings, and they agreed to set up the World Faiths Development Dialogue, which seemed like a pretty innocuous idea. It's dialogue. There's no money involved. But basically, all hell broke loose. And Wolfensohn was fond of saying that it was 184-0 in the member countries of the World Bank opposed to it. So we had to do a lot of thinking, and I'm going to show you some slides on that. Another practical issue that was in my own experience in the East Asia crisis, 1998, Indonesia suddenly went into a massive crisis, and there were huge social challenges coming out of that. And I was part of some meetings with the big Muslim organizations in Indonesia, NU and Muhammadiyah, who basically were very well equipped and could have mobilized large social safety net programs. But because the World Bank had zero relationships, none of the development community had serious relationships with these organizations, it was not possible to work during that period. So this is a consequence. And another practical example is that when the malaria campaigns in DRC got started, one of the initiatives was on distribution of nets, and they had failed to consult with the religious leaders in the capital, Kinshasa, and so they launched a major opposition, sort of like some of the opposition to vaccination, but in this case it was to mosquito nets. And it wasn't until they actually realized that they had to engage with the religious leaders that the program succeeded. So these are just by way of illustration. I have many, many more, but those are a few. On the definition issue, I was saying yesterday that one of the things that I've started to try to do is not to use the word religion, but to use an adjective. In other words, religious beliefs, ideas, ethics, institutions, leaders, actors, communities. In a sense, what that does is it forces you to be a little bit more specific as to what it is that you're talking about, because in almost every conversation this comes back. And another thing that I think is interesting is that if you actually look at the way the development profession has dealt with culture, and I'm sure Afifa has views on this, there have been enormous difficulties in figuring out how to deal with culture as well. Sort of everybody knows culture is important, probably more than religion, and yet there are very, very few effective tools for taking culture into account, and you run into all kinds of barriers. So it's worth, I think, keeping those. Part of having the difficulties on data is a big issue. Quentin may or may not agree with this, but I have heard estimates from people like Ban Ki-moon and others who should know better, basically using figures on the share of health care in Africa provided by religious organizations ranging from 7 to 70%. I mean, that's a very wide range. And what it suggests is huge differences in definition, failure to recognize differences among countries, and very, very loose use of data. But there are similar numbers kicking around. I was in a meeting, the one in Berlin, where somebody said 50% of education in Africa is provided by religious organizations, which is ridiculous. It's not true. At one point, it might have been during the missionary period, but it certainly isn't true now. The numbers and other numbers, some of this comes out of an organization called ARC, which is heroic, and Prince Philip is their guru. But one of the numbers that they use is, I think, that 30% of the world's land is either owned or controlled by religious organizations, and I think 20% of the world's assets, financial assets. So the point is, it's big, it's important, but when you're dealing with that kind of range of numbers, it really does make the task much more difficult. So again, specific debates. Why has it been so difficult? I think we're all asking. Legal, constitutional, the politics issue. This is one we hear all the time, and some of it is the politicization of religion and the religionization of politics. Is the way people put it. And that is the first reaction on almost any religious issue, is that this is really about politics. And I think we need to get behind what that means. The issues of representation are huge. Who represents what? I have one colleague who has a website where she posts every time there's a meeting about religious issues, and that it's all men. And there are many, many, many examples of all men, mostly older men. So the women and the youth issues loom very, very large in the lack of dialogue. We talk a lot about seats at tables, but which tables are we talking about? There are efforts to bring religious voices into the G20, the G8, into consultations on safeguard policies, into the Sustainable Development Goals, into local aid coordination, but it's not systematic. It's very much all over the place, and in many ways this issue of who's at the table. One of the phrases we cite often is, if you're not at the table, you end up on the menu. So everybody wants to be at the table, but it's not clear which table they're talking about and what that means. I have two charts which you're not going to be able to read, and I'm not going to go through them, but they're in my book and you can have them if you want. But these come out of what was basically 6 months of dialogue with 184 countries via their executive directors. And so this one, I call it the 3 Ds and an E and the 5 Es and a D. So the 3 Ds are basically that religion is divisive and political, that religion is dangerous. In other words, it's against development, it's patriarchal, it's against reproductive health, LGBT rights, etc. And the third, that religion is basically defunct, not important, not a priority. The E that I have is, this is actually not dissimilar from earlier discussions on gender topics, that people don't approach these issues necessarily with their brains. They approach them emotionally. They approach them, what do I believe? My experience with my pastor. So it's extremely difficult to have adult conversations. So this one is sort of all the objections that the development people raised when we went talking to all these representatives. And we hear them again and again. On the religion side, where they're just as strong, the 5 Es are that it's about empire, that the whole development enterprise is U.S.-led, that it's about multinational companies, et cetera, that the institutions are unethical. They don't talk about ethics. They're unprincipled. The effects of development, whether it's disruption of communities. Economics is seen as a theology, and it's often, there are many, many parallels. They preach, they believe in unseen forces, the hand of the market. They don't listen. So the dominance of economics and people's difficulty in understanding economics is a big issue. And the fact that the discipline and the institutions are seen as enigmatic. And the upshot is that it's dangerous. So I'm probably coming to the end of the time, am I, Emma? But there are eight live issues that I thought I'd at least list. Okay. Clearly, the issue of violence and religion comes up all the time. It's in many ways it's the leading edge into issues these days. The security aspect, clearly with ISIS, with Boko Haram, with the Syria situation, but also in Myanmar, even in southern Thailand. It's the issue that certainly gets the most attention. We did consultations, we being the Berkley Center and WFDD, in 6 world regions, and we're now working in 5 countries to try to make this more specific. And an issue that came up time and time again is proselytizing. And it comes down to the perception of the motivation of religious organizations and the sense that what they're really after is converts. And what that's led us to conclude is that we really need to get into the proselytizing issue with codes of conduct, et cetera, where it relates to development more than pure religious freedom. And the proselytizing issue on development relates to the role of money, and it relates to asymmetries of power. So we're having a meeting on the 4th of March here, which is the Religious Freedom Project and the development within the Berkley Center, collaborating to try to explore these issues. Time and time again, it comes up all the time, gender issues. And the perception of a lot of the religious actors, using it very broadly, is that they love women. They love motherhood. They're the leading figures protecting womanhood, et cetera. But the development community sees religious actors as basically patriarchal and opposed to gender equality. And that's a major obstacle. It's a major issue. It's major. And the fact that there are so many of these meetings with all men accentuates that image and makes it much more difficult to have the kind of dialogue we're talking about. In the aid community, aid harmonization is a huge issue. The fragmentation, the sorcerer's apprentice issue, and a lot of religious organizations are outside of the aid harmonization. And so not part of the sort of central thrust now, which is get our act together. Let's get with it. Let's have government-led, coherent, strategic approaches so you don't have 20 people trying to see the minister of finance, et cetera. And getting the religious figures into that is a major challenge. Huge numbers of issues on governance. And governance is both an understanding of the roles and responsibilities of the state. It is also very specifically corruption. And one of the issues that we're concerned about is how rarely religious figures are part of the integrity movements and the anti-corruption movements. And it's an area where there should be a huge potential, and it's one that is worth working on. The accusation of instrumentalization is a big issue. It's partly a perception issue. It's partly a reality issue. Some people tell me that I'm instrumentalizing religion. The problem is that if you're going to go talk to a health specialist about religious engagement on malaria or on maternal mortality, you have to convince them that this is actually going to make a difference, that it's important. And that sounds like instrumentalization. And you do get the reaction of, okay, well, we'll just give them the sermon and they can deliver the sermon, which gets you nowhere, obviously, if you have that kind of an exchange, the very instrumental. All sorts of issues around human rights. And there are still a lot of very basic issues on development models. I'm amazed at how often you hear what you might call 70s and 80s discourse about neoliberal models and Washington consensus and stuff like that. These are important issues, but there's been a lot of movement in the way people who are directly involved in policy decisions see these issues, and is often not very helpful to have these debates that they see as having been addressed several decades ago coming on. So again, we talk a lot about religious literacy, but we also among development actors, but we also talk about development literacy among religious actors, and how is that possible? I know the University of Birmingham actually did some work on that at one point. So I have actually some notes on all of these, but I think that I've probably talked pretty much enough. Let me come to the final, some of my bottom line. By the way, just on on the gender issue, just as the kind of quotation of what we hear in Bangladesh. Bangladesh, leading country in gender relations, Sufi Islam, etc. But this is from the newspaper not very long ago. You women should stay within the four walls of your houses. Sitting inside your husband's home, you should take care of your husband's furniture. Women are like a tamarind, a fruit that any man would like to touch. I mean, these are the kinds of attitudes that people hear and that they react to, and that suggest that we need to focus a lot on questions of rethinking gender. My own view is that we should focus a lot on the fragile states. It's a major issue in development. How do you deal with the weakest countries and the weakest parts of countries? Ones where there is questioning of authority. The Horn of Africa clearly falls into that category. It is very striking in the literature on fragile states. There's almost nothing about religion in the sort of strategic documents, in the thinking about it. And yet, in most cases, their religion seen as part of the problem, as we discussed yesterday, and yet a lot of the infrastructure is religious, a lot of the adherence, the identification, etc. So this should be, I think, a prime foreign policy and development focus. And obviously service delivery is another area that's obvious, health and education, and as you get into sustainable development goals in the post-2015, that's going to be a major issue. And climate change is another very obvious issue where there's been a lot of academic work, there's been a lot of policy work, there are a lot of very passionate actors. There was a substantial religious mobilization around the Lima meeting in December, and I think there will be clearly around Paris. And the Pope is just about to come out with an encyclical, and so there's really going to be a lot of opportunity, I think, to make climate change beyond the platitudes and beyond the futile debates into something that can be constructive. So Monday morning, what next? I think we need to support leadership and recognize, engage, broaden, and train. I think until we take this to specific countries, it has very little meaning. So that's why what we've done now that we've done the regional approaches, that we're focusing on 4 countries, Bangladesh, 5 countries actually, Bangladesh, Cambodia, Kenya, Senegal, and Guatemala, which will hopefully give us much more grist to make the arguments. Some regional organizations, ASEAN has just come out with a huge report. It was presented earlier this week on religious freedom by country, and so there should be a potential within that context. Religious and development literacy, figure out which tables who should be at and what they should be doing at the tables. I think that's important in terms of policy. And I think there needs to be more engagement on tough issues. Including issues like gender, LGBT, to try to address them. I think issues like proselytizing is one that we should be dealing with, and dealing with attitudes and fears. I'm also interested and have had some discussions with the religious authorities in Morocco about trying to take some of the newer indicators. In this case, the one that they're particularly interested in is the Social Progress Index, which has an organization. It was presented at the Skoll conference, but it's being used by Paraguay and several states in Brazil and some other countries as what the French call the tableau de bord, sort of the panel, the control panel, and trying to bring more religious data and meaningful questions into those kinds of efforts, I think is useful. Research and information. And then big question, which I think has not been mentioned here at all, is both ecumenical and interfaith alliances and approaches, which I think it's very appealing for governments, clearly, because you get away from the issue of favoritism. Plus, the idea is that by having religious and faith groups working together, that you diminish tensions and also give yourself a platform when there are issues that arise. And so rethinking some of the issues around interfaith, I think, is a global priority.